Welkom bij de Leiderschapspodcast van City Life Church. Dit is Leadership Talks.
Leadership Talks. Elke vierde dinsdag van de maand gaan we in gesprek met iemand. En in dit geval een Engelstalig gesprek met Mal Fletcher. So from now on we'll go in English. Mal Fletcher, thank you for being with us. We already heard from you here live at the Leaders Conference. Very interesting material. And today we'll be doing an interview talking about leadership, also talking about the future a little bit. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great.
Even if you get to sit on a better seat than me.
Yes, they said you had the best background now.
I have the best background, but I can't see it.
Right, so every Leadership Talks episode starts with this one statement. It's John Maxwell's quote, which says, leadership is the problem and leadership is the answer. What is your view on that?
I think I understand the sentiment. I don't totally agree with the statement. I think leadership on its own can't achieve anything without people who follow. So sometimes we forget that the people who follow are important to the leader, just as the leader is important to the people that follow. Collectively, we bring about change. I believe my definition of leader has come about over many years of thinking about it, and it took me many years to get to this sentence. A leader is someone who articulates a vision, maps out a strategy, marshals activity to create an environment in which people flourish and projects fly. So let me just repeat that. A leader is someone who articulates vision of the preferred future, not just the future of the organization, but the future of the wider city. Having done that, we develop strategy, because vision without strategy is just wishful thinking. Having done that, we marshal activity, which means we bring people into the enterprise, whether it's a church or a business or whatever, that complement our gifts, have different gifts than us. And having done that, we're creating an environment or a culture in which people flourish and projects fly. I believe leaders are cultural architects. That's what they do. Managers are structural engineers. They're important, but leadership is something different. They're cultural architects. But without people following, leadership can't really change anything much.
Interesting. Wow, that's a good start. All right, so before we would dive into more of this, I found a few of your books. And this one particularly is your oldest, as you said. It's called Youth, the Endangered Species, Helping Youth Survive in the 90s. Since you published this one in 1991, I just turned one when your book came out. And I still remember how good it was. No. This one actually, and I would like to quote something from the book, just because it's very interesting. Actually, I was preparing even last night, and it was so inspired that I almost forgot to stop reading. Where's the quote? Here it is. It says, from time to time, the church must change if it is to affect its society. And this is what you wrote in the 90s, talking about the importance of reaching the next generation. I think right now, still important. But how would you say the church needs to change, or where? What is the relationship between the church and the society?
That's a great question, Joshua. I think the church is, according to Christ, among other things, like a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. And in one of the other sessions here, I'll be talking a bit more about that. I think that in part what Jesus was telling us as the church is that we are to be in microcosm what the city could be if it lived under the values of the kingdom. So I'm not talking about an individual church. I'm talking about the church collectively across a city should be setting an example for the city of what it could be. So we should be able to say to the politicians of our cities, if you want to know how to share vision with integrity, look at us, we're your city on a hill. We should be able to say to the educators of our cities, if you want to know how to raise up a generation that lives for something more than just self and materialism, Look at us, where you're sitting on a hill. I think that's the role of the church and society, to be the model of what the city could be.
Wow.
And that changes a lot of things. It changes the way preachers preach. It changes the worship songs we write. It changes the activities we get involved in outside of Sunday. It changes a lot of things.
Yes, definitely. So since I found especially this book, but also over your earlier years, you've been working a lot with youth and next generation. You were actually the founder of Youth Alive in Australia before churches like Planet Shaker were even started, or Hillsong Church wasn't even out there yet. There's been a lot of fruit from that, a lot of influence in the world and in the Christian world, especially over the years out of that. You said that, for example, Pastor Gary Clark, Phil Dooley, Russell Evans from Planet Shakers came out of the Youth Alive ministry. Beautiful. So it's very interesting to see you work with youth and young adults over those years, and now you ended up becoming a social futurist. And how did that go over those years? How did you end up from working with churches and youth in working with companies and businesses and organizations? How was that journey for you, and why did you do that?
Well, the DNA is still the same. I mean, I'm still essentially the same, not the same person, we all grow, but I'm still driven by the same things. I'm driven by the desire to help people see that, as a Christian, that God is relevant to every situation and every time in history. And so Futurism for me came out largely of doing research into young people, because I was leading this national organisation that grew from 300 in Melbourne alone to 80,000 across Australia in 10 years.
Wow.
10 years. So we were trying to get ahead of that and say, well, where are young people going? What's concerning them? What's driving them? What are the changes that will affect them? So that research then, when I came to live in Europe in the mid-90s, started to shift a little bit and become broader, to the point where when we moved to the UK in 2004, it became something that the BBC and others wanted to know about. It's not just research on generations by now, it's on technology and ethics and social values and many other things. But it's always driven by the same Christian worldview. I had an interviewer, the arts editor for the BBC, who's a very high-ranking person. In the middle of an interview one time, he stopped me and he said, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think that Christians are persecuted in the UK?" And I said, "No, here are my reasons." But I like to think something in what I was saying suggested a different worldview. Mm-hmm. And that's the role of the Christian, to provoke curiosity.
Beautiful, different worldview.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the books that you wrote was The Pioneer Spirit, Redesigning the Future Through the Power of Faith. And as we here at this conference, we already heard you speak this morning, and we'll have some more from you tomorrow. But one of the things that you seem to be very convinced about, very, very clear about, is how important it is for a church to be part of redesigning the future. What does that look like for you if you would look at churches and their potential in that area?
Well, I think it starts, this is where leadership is important, where a leader who is not curious about the city and the world in which they live will never lead a church that is curious about the city. And if you're not curious, you'll never have influence. Mm-hmm. One of the key things about leadership of anything is remaining curious over many years, staying fresh, exploring new ideas always. I think that every pastor of every church should take at least one day a month, one full day, to do nothing but go and sit in an art gallery or a museum, or go to some other go to the theatre or something. Just do something that gets them out of church world completely, mm-hmm. and allows them to have fresh thoughts and ideas and exposure to different thoughts. For some people it might be going to a library, whatever. Mm-hmm. It's important that we make it a discipline of our lives, because curiosity is what gives you longevity. Without it, you'll last 10 years and then you're boring. Once you become boring, Even church people don't listen to you, much less people out there. People in church will be nice to you for a while. They'll say, oh, yeah, it's great, Pastor, thanks very much, really enjoyed that. But behind the scenes, you're thinking, oh, that was so boring. But if you're curious, it comes through. If you're exposing yourself to new ideas, reading... Let me ask you a question to anyone watching this and to those here today. When was the last time we read a book that we wouldn't normally read? Not a book about something that's unchristian, but not a Christian book, just a good book. C.S. Lewis said, all truth is God's truth. So if a thing is true, it doesn't have to be written by a Christian to be true. When did we last have coffee with someone who doesn't agree with us on everything? See, dissent is not disloyalty. I wish more pastors knew this, because we'd have a lot more interesting pastors and more interesting lives. People can disagree with me in the media and online, and they're not necessarily out to hurt me. They're not disloyal, they're just disagreeing. Yep. That's okay. Yep. So those sorts of questions are really important to producing leaders that are growing all the time themselves, and that creates influence.
Beautiful, beautiful. And do you think that as most of them, most of the people who listen and also are here are not pastors, this would apply for them as well, and how they would work in their jobs and interact with people? How do you see that influential church being their best on Monday? What does that look like?
Well, it looks like recognizing that everybody is called. You know, 10% of Israel were priests, just 10%. So what's the other 90%? Are they peripheral? Are they extras in the great drama that God is playing out? No, they're central to it. The priests were there to help them be the representative of God to the nations. So someone who's in business, or someone who's in design, or someone who's entertainment and media, they're just as called as the preacher is. But we've been slow to let them know that. And if we do let them know that, we don't tell them then how to be a Christian in that role. Let me give you an example. I was speaking in a church in Aberdeen, which is the oil capital of the UK. So there are similarities between Shell, say, and Aberdeen. And the woman came to the church I was speaking in, and her pastor I'd been mentoring for some years on civic influence. So he was starting to have influence in the city. And she came to him after the service, a middle-aged woman, very well made up, crying. And he wasn't used to seeing her crying. She was a senior executive in an oil company. And he said, "What's the matter?" She said, "This is the first Sunday I ever realized that God called me to lead an oil company." That's so liberating. You know, it's so liberating for someone to know, I'm in technology and God called me here. But when the preacher starts talking about these are the benefits of technology and this is how to use it, that person thinks, yeah, that's okay. This is my calling, and it's a God thing. But if all we ever do is promote singers and preachers, then the people who are not called to that think, what's here for me? It's very important.
Wow, beautiful. Well, that's amazing. Thank you. And I think one of the things that I think that's part of what's in this book. I just mentioned it, the Pioneer Spirit. The funny thing is, most of the books are quite old, and you were even surprised that I got the paperback versions. But I loved it. I think one of the things that's very inspiring as I read from you is that you are always very strategic about the influence of the church and about how we should, from out of our faith, should influence this world. And on the other hand, you yourself are working on thoughts and visions of the future. Obviously, you started 2030 Plus, which is all about change now and towards the future. What things would you say should we look at in the near future that are very important to us as a church, or maybe us as a society, that you think that we should not miss this when it comes to the near future?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't get often asked that one, so thank you. I remember, just to preface that, I remember in 1995, 96, speaking to leaders around the world, church leaders, about the internet and how we should be using the internet and how to use it. And I had one of them come to me recently who is a very good church leader, has a very big church in Australia. He said, I didn't even know what the internet was when you were talking about that. I looked at the person next to me, and he's a very contemporary person. He said, "What's the internet?" We've got to do better than that. Artificial intelligence, I mentioned in a session this morning, is a concern for various reasons, but it also has some very positives to it. One of them will be allowing us, for example, to simultaneously translate services without any human being being the translator. So a machine or network of computers online is able to simultaneously translate. That's artificial intelligence at work. And it will do a better job in many cases than a human being will if it's been set up properly. I'm not saying we put human beings out of work. I'm just saying that we use the technology for good. Right? There's the possibility of taking all of the teachings of great Christians through the centuries on one issue and putting them all together in modern language in one book. Imagine that book. All the great Christian thinkers of every denominational persuasion through the centuries on whatever subject you choose. Human sexuality, what do they say about this? One book. Artificial intelligence can do that. Human beings find that very difficult because it's so much data.
Beautiful. That's amazing. Yeah. And so I can imagine for us as a church, when it comes to those kind of things, not even as a church, but as a society, there's a lot of new things about to come. And one of the things that I actually want to mention, it's actually in this book. It is a quote which is quite. It's probably what you were talking about now. In the days ahead, Christian leaders, artists, and ministries will need to stay in touch with emerging media technologies and techniques. Change in methods and media is necessary if we are to use our gifts to the fullest. And I think, and then you talk about forward thinking, bold strategic planning, and we must be praying and planning for success. So this is also written about 10 years ago. The other book was 30 years ago. Somehow it's still very relevant to me as I read it. I enjoy it very much. But how do you say that as a leader in or outside church, maybe both roles together in one person, but how can we as normal people, not all of us work with AI, or not all of us work in these spheres, or maybe not yet. How can we be aware of the changing society and be part of it while doing what we do? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's right. It's the gap between where the society is heading towards and our own personal lives, and just still be part of that, or maybe even do influence that.
It's not really about what you know. I mean, it's my job as a futurist to know things that everybody else doesn't know, and if they did, I wouldn't have a job.
That's true, yeah.
So, that's my role. But what I encourage people to do is, one, be curious about the world they live in. Two, read always outside your comfort zone. Never take one newspaper as your only source. Always read several newspapers as often as you can from different types of worldview, centre, right, left. I think it's important that we are future friendly. Now, that means a lot of things. It means, for example, that we're not paranoid about the world we live in. Christians, especially Pentecostal Christians, and I'm third generation Pentecostal, so I'm talking to my family, we're really good at being paranoid. Look at the COVID crisis. I had pastors, really good pastors, saying the most ridiculous things. Essentially conspiracy theories, had no foundation in science at all. And I'm not making a statement here about vaccines or non-vaccines. This is not the place for that. Mm-hmm. That's not what I'm addressing. Other theories that have nothing to do with reality. And all they had to do was simply make a couple of checks and they would have found out that doesn't add up. That doesn't even make sense. It's dangerous to the church to be paranoid. It's dangerous for us to feel persecuted when we're not. Because you cannot engage a culture you have declared your enemy.
Yeah.
If you say the Dutch culture is naturally my enemy, you will never engage it. That's one of the reasons Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hurt you, because you can't stay engaged if you're putting people at arm's length and saying, you're out to hurt me, so I'm not going near you. We've got to stop being paranoid and being us versus them, because in the New Testament, it's us and them. Church and the world. Church in the world, not church versus the world. That's not even New Testament.
Wow.
That's a big shift in our thinking, isn't it?
Yes.
It might take a while for some of us to think that through, but it's so important. Otherwise, we're just continuing to, as a friend of mine, Pastor Reimagining, says, build a subculture on the edge of the mainstream. And I don't want to do that. I don't see the point. That's not what Jesus died for, so that I could be more boring than I was before. He wants me to have something to say to my world. It's his world, you know.
Beautiful. Yeah. So and just on this, do you think there's areas in? I can imagine there's, so to speak, typical Christian areas, spheres of influence in the society. I can imagine also here there's a big hospital just down the road. Lots of people from our church work there. There's the Salvation Army is quite large in The Hague, and there's even my wife works there. There's a lot of Christian people in certain areas of the society, but also there's areas who might be more dark or more unreached or more uninfluenced by the church, by Christians. What would you say would be those areas, and how to look at them?
Well, the way to look at them is the way Jesus looked at sinners. He said, I didn't come to save the righteous. I come to bring sinners to repentance. You go to the darkest places. The only time in my life when I pioneered a church, I was a pastor for 9 years. It's a long time ago. But I remember it well. And we chose to plant a church in what was the second biggest occult centre of Australia. Now, it's a lot more common now, but it wasn't then. We had witches having shops in the main street of the town. That's where we went to plant a church. There wasn't a good church there. I've always believed that you don't make God's name great by doing things you can do without him. You make God's name great by doing things that couldn't possibly be done. When I came to Europe, my wife and I made the decision in the early 90s to leave Youth Alive at 80,000 people and come to live in Copenhagen, Denmark. What? One of my fathers in the faith said, Mal, why would you go to Europe where nothing ever happens?
Yes.
And then it wasn't clear that a lot was happening. There's a lot happening now. But I believe then, as I believe now, you do what people think is against the odds, because that's when God turns up.
Yeah.
And that's what we've done the same with media. We've done the same in going into political areas. In 2015, we held the first ever in history summit of church leaders in the German parliament. It had never happened in history.
Wow.
20 key leaders from across Europe. Leaders like Gary Clark, Phil Dooley was there. Even though he was from Cape Town, we let him in. And we had this big round table and heard about sessions about how to change cultures. And these leaders were so touched by being in this place of great authority where big decisions are made. I think you do what people say can't be done in God's name.
Wow.
You do it wisely, but you do it boldly. And that's what makes God's name great. So you look for the dark places.
Beautiful. Wow. So what would you say to people? There might be a lot of listeners, there might be a lot of people here who might have vision or maybe hopes for those areas, might be insecure about whether or not to try to start businesses or do anything in those areas. What would you say as the closing of this conversation to those people?
Oh, I'd say go with the fear. Don't run from it. Face it. It's the only way through is to face the thing and move beyond it. And a friend of mine, I love this. I wish I'd said it. One day I'm going to write a book called Things I Wish I'd Said. And this is one of them. He said, Mal, if I don't wake up in the morning and feel a little bit frightened, it's probably not the will of God.
Wow.
And I thought, yeah. Because the Jesus you and I serve is not safe. He never was, Read the Gospels. He's not safe. He's dangerous. People say, oh, you've heard it. People say, wouldn't it be great to be around when Jesus was around? I'm not so sure. Here's Peter, one of Jesus' best friends. He's saying, I think you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well done, Simon, son of Jonah. Blessed are you. The next chapter of the same gospel, Paul is saying, oh, the cross will never happen. You'll never go to the cross. That won't happen. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Same guy.
Yeah.
This is Jesus.
Yep.
He's dangerous to be around. And I don't think we do him any favors if we play it safe because we're afraid. I'm always afraid. I'm afraid of things constantly. That's the honest truth. It would be easy for me to stand up here and say, praise God, faith works, I'm never afraid of nothing. I don't believe that for a minute. Everybody gets afraid. The point is, are you going to run toward it and say, if God wants me to do this, sure, I'm going to be afraid, but it's worth doing if I'm afraid. Is that...
Yeah, beautiful. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very
much. Thank you very much. Time flies. Time flies. And I would like to close with mentioning your website is 2030plus.com, which actually offers a lot of articles and media, different kind of things, videos and stuff on whatever you're working on or writing about, talking about when it comes to the future and the changes that we are in right now. Definitely worth a read. So 2030.com plus.com, 2030plus.com. is where a lot of your materials is to see or read. Thank you for being with us. And once again, Leadership Talks every 4th Tuesday of the month. Ladies and gentlemen, you can subscribe or directly from YouTube or iTunes. It's all good. Share it with people who might want to be inspired by this, because I think this was a really, really good conversation. Thank you, Mal.